So here's the objection. Let me lay out the objection so you understand it. Some people will say, look, you can't use the New Testament as a source of historical information because it's been corrupted over the centuries. As the copying process, before we had the printing press, before you could just print off a copy of the New Testament, it had to be copied by hand. And we know that that process is notoriously filled with errors and mistakes and copying mistakes and variants in the text, and that those copying, there's thousands and thousands of copying errors that have been made in the transmission of the New Testament, such that we'd have no idea what the original actually said. And so we can't trust the New Testament as a historical source because it's been corrupted by all of these copying mistakes. So we need to address this and make sure that we're aware of how this copying process has worked, how our New Testament came down to us today. Because the fact of the matter is, the Bible that you are holding in your hands right now does have thousands and thousands of copying mistakes in it. Okay, that is a fact. But people sometimes will take that fact and make more out of it than is really there. Does that make sense? Once you understand these copying errors and these copying mistakes that did in fact happen, and that our Bible has them in it, our copy of the New Testament is not the original, there's been copying mistakes. If you know and understand how the process worked, you'll see it's really not as scary as it sounds. So let's walk through this process and make sure that we all understand, not even for our own sake, but as we're helping other people with their questions and doubts and their faith, we want to be there for them and understand this process. So bear with me as we work through the details. The fact of the matter is we don't have the original, right? You can't go to a museum and look at the original in the New Testament anywhere in the world. It's not like our Declaration of Independence. It's not like our Constitution where you can go and see the original. We don't have the original. And we should admit that and acknowledge we don't have the original New Testament. All we have are copies of it. And we know that the copying process, mistakes are made when copies are made by hand like that, and they were for centuries. The question becomes, and this is the case with all ancient documents. This isn't unique about the New Testament. We don't have any original documents from the ancient world. All we have are copies. And so what scholars have to do is recreate the original from the copies that we have. And this is what we do with the New Testament as well. We try to recreate the New Testament, the original, from the copies that have mistakes in them. The question then becomes, how accurate can we get back to the original? How accurate can we recreate the original New Testament? Now, in this process, the scholars that devote their lives to this procedure, looking at all these copies, trying to recreate the original, the two main things that they look for that increases their certainty on how well they can recreate the original is the length of time between when the original was written and the earliest surviving copies. Now, the less time there, the better, obviously. That makes sense, right? The more time that's in there, the more room there is for copying mistakes to be made. So the shorter the time, the better. And then the second thing historians look for is the number of copies. Obviously, the more copies we have, the more that we can compare and see where the different mistakes were made and try to recreate the original. So let's do a little bit of competition. Let's do a competition of ancient documents and see how the New Testament stacks up on these two criteria. We can start with maybe Aristotle, right? Aristotle wrote 300 years before Christ. And the earliest surviving copies we have of Aristotle's works is from 1100 AD. So think about that for a moment. 1400 years between when the original was written and the earliest surviving copy that we have. That's a lot of room for error. It's a lot of room for copying mistakes. But we still read Aristotle, we still quote Aristotle, right? Herodotus is another ancient work, well-known ancient work. Herodotus was a historian in the ancient world. He wrote his historical accounts around 400 BC. Earliest surviving copy we have is from AD 900, difference of 1300 years, not much difference than Aristotle, but we're getting better, we're getting closer. Caesar's Gallic War is another one, written 50 BC. Earliest surviving copy we have 900, so we're talking less than 1,000 years now, doing better. Homer's Odyssey, many of you got the opportunity to read that in school, or maybe some of you will read that soon. Probably one of the most famous works from the ancient world. Written 800 years before Christ, and amazingly enough, look at this, we have a copy of Homer's Odyssey dated from 300 BC. So documents do survive that long, but still, it's just a copy. And now we're down to 500 years. These are some of the most popular works of the ancient world. And this is what scholars have to work with, the earliest copies we have of them. All right, well, in this competition then, let's move on to the New Testament and see how it stacks up. As Ehrman's going to point out later as we go through the rest of his book, he'll explain the various dates that are given for the New Testament books, but everybody agrees, and Ehrman will say this as well, everybody agrees by the end of the first century, the New Testament was completely written. All the books were written in the first century, okay? So that's when it was written, some earlier, some later. We know there's 27 different books, but all in the first century. So what are the earliest surviving copies we have of the New Testament? Well, one of them that we have is the Chester Beatty manuscript. Now this includes most of the New Testament, all 4 Gospels, and it's dated to 250 AD. So we're talking a difference of 150 to 200 years. Still some room in there, right, for copying mistakes to be made, but not nearly as much time as those other documents we looked at. But we can go even earlier than this. Take, for instance, the Bodmer manuscript. This includes several New Testament books and is dated to AD 200. So now we're talking a difference of 100, 150 years. But we can get even closer because scholars have discovered the John Ryland manuscript, which is merely a portion of John, but it's still substantial. So now our earliest copy is within 20 to 70 years, which is really remarkable for an ancient document to have copies that go back that close to the original. All right, the other thing that historians look for then when they're trying to recreate an ancient document is the number of copies. And that makes sense, right? The more copies you have, the better. So if you have a lot of copies, you can kind of see where different copyists made different mistakes. Because here's one of the reasons why these copying errors they're not as big of a deal as some people make of them. Because when people make handwritten copies, they do make mistakes. But we could say, and sometimes I do this with the fun experiment, youth groups and such, I'll take a page out of a dictionary. And if we have time in a youth group night or something, and I'll take that page out of a dictionary and we'll send it around and have all the youth try to make a handwritten copy of that page, right? And then I'll get the original page of the dictionary back and I'll rip up the original. And then we don't have the original anymore. All we have now are your copies. And you guys all made mistakes, right? When you made your handwritten copy of that page of the dictionary, you all made mistakes. So there's probably going to, if we count them all up, I mean, you probably made 3 mistakes. You probably made 12 mistakes, right? Everybody's going to be, so if we counted up the mistakes, there'd probably be hundreds of them. But the thing is, you have made your copying mistakes most likely in different places, right? And so if we got all your copies together and we compared them and looked at them, we could recreate, even though there's a lot of mistakes, we could recreate the original with a pretty high degree of accuracy, right? Because the mistakes were made in different places. And so you can look at simple examples, right? You can look at examples of copies. This is just a hypothetical one. This isn't an actual verse. But I just wanted to use a simple example. You can see maybe we have these different copies, and yes, there's differences, They made mistakes. They changed words a little bit here or there. But as you look at that, you can, for the most part, I think it's pretty reasonable to say, look, the original was most likely this. And even if we're wrong, even if it was Cephas, because that was just another name for Peter, that really wouldn't change much in the meaning of the text, right? Or if they would have said, actually, no, the original said it was a big camel, not a large camel. Well, does that really change the meaning? No. And this is how most of the copying mistakes actually are when you look into them. As Ehrman's going to say, we'll see a quote from him as we wrap things up. But let's do another competition here. Let's look at the number of copies. The more copies we have, the better. If there's only maybe 3 of you making a copy of that dictionary, that wouldn't be nearly as good as if we had, how many people we have here? 40 people. If we had 1,000 people, that would be even better, because again, there'd be mistakes made, but in different places. The more copies we have, the better we can recreate the original. So Aristotle's work, we only have 5 copies. Not many to go off of. But we still quote Aristotle, we still study Aristotle, we still assume for the most part these were his ideas, this is what he said, right? Herodotus, we only have 8 copies of that from the ancient world. Caesar's Gallic War, 10 copies. Now I chose another work by Homer, the Iliad, because from the ancient world, the Iliad would probably have one of the most copies of this ancient work. So pretty impressive with the Iliad, 643 copies from the ancient world. How would you like that to be your job? Studying 600, laying out, first you got to lay out 643 copies of this, and then compare word for word, sentence for sentence, all the differences. But I'm thankful for people who do this with all ancient documents, trying to recreate the original so that we can have, as best as possible, what the original said. But it's tedious work. It's a field called textual criticism. All right, how does this compare to the New Testament? I hope you'll be blown away by this. Look at this. When it comes to the New Testament, we have 6,000 Greek copies, 9,000 Latin copies, and 8,000 copies from other languages. Sometimes people will ask, okay, well, when are most of these copies from? Because the way that scholars compile these numbers is they look at all the copies made before the printing press, right? Because after that, people didn't make handwritten copies anymore. So all of these copies are before the printing press, but this is impressive as well. If you think of the New Testament, there's approximately 8,000 verses in the New Testament, and 43%, almost half of those verses, are found in manuscripts that date from before 200, so 2nd century. Not only do we have all of these copies, but we have a lot of quotes from early church leaders. So in the early church, just like nowadays, people are writing commentaries, people are writing songs about the Bible, right? They're including verses in their devotions and their letters to each other. And so we have not only the copies of the New Testament, but we have a lot of quotes of the New Testament from early church leaders. And so those aren't included in those numbers that I gave you prior. So this is a tough job. All right, so how closely can we get back to the original? With all these copies and with all these early copies, how close can we recreate the original? Let's have one final competition here. Now this is going to come from Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger has a really famous quote concerning this, and that's what I want to share with you. You might remember this is the guy who Ehrman did his PhD under at Princeton. So Bart Ehrman, one of the most well-known New Testament scholars of the 20th century, over 50 years, professor at Princeton. You can check him out on Wikipedia. Passed away in 2007, I guess. But several academic works. He specialized in this area of textual criticism. So here's a famous work of his from the 1990s, The Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration. Right? Copying errors is the corruption, and then restoring it. So this quote comes from Bruce Metzger, and he's doing a kind of a competition. He's laying out other ancient documents. So let's just narrow it down to the Iliad and the New Testament. According to Metzger, with the Iliad, 643 copies, we can compare, recreate the original. We can get to a high degree of accuracy, 95%. We can recreate the original with that degree of accuracy when it comes to the Iliad. What about the New Testament? In spite of the fact that there's thousands and thousands of copying errors in all these different copies of the New Testament, in spite of that, because we have so many copies and because we have so many early copies, we can recreate, according to Metzger, the New Testament with the degree of accuracy 99.5%. Pretty impressive. Here's what Ehrman has to say about this issue. Ehrman, writing of his mentor, Metzger, wrote that Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times. I dedicated, and this is another book he's talking about now, but Ehrman says he dedicates this particular book to him, his mentor, who he got his PhD under, Metzger, because he was my inspiration for going into this field of textual criticism and the person who trained me. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him, even though we disagree on important religious questions. He, Metzger, is a firmly committed Christian, and I, Ehrman, is not. We're in complete agreement, though, on a number of very important historical and textual questions. For example, if Metzger and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement, maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for, and this is the book he's talking about now, this is the quote from Misquoting Jesus, does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position, that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by these textual variants, these copying mistakes in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. And here's why. Here's why that 0.5% is not really that big of a deal, because the vast majority of them just have to do with things that don't really matter in the meaning of the sentences. They're different spellings, they're different names for the same person, Peter, Cephas. Very few of them, if hardly any, would affect the actual meaning of the sentence. And then when it is, it's things like whether it was a large camel or a big camel, or a gigantic camel. You know, all of those different words kind of mean the same thing. So even if we're not sure exactly what the original said, it's not as though, and this is what some people give the impression, it's not as though some of the copies in the New Testament says that Jesus walked on water and some of them say he didn't, right? It's nothing like that. So these copying errors should not cause anybody to struggle with their faith or reject that the New Testament, reject the idea of using the New Testament as a source of historical information. Okay. One last quote here from Dr. Ehrman, and we'll be done. And again, this is his explanation of why this objection just doesn't hold any water. Okay. Take a look at this. Dr. Ehrman wrote, "The manuscripts of the New Testament do indeed have large number of variations in them. Alternative ways of wording a verse or a passage, omissions of words or sentences at times, additional insertions of words, sentences here and there. But the problem is not of such a scope as to make it impossible to have any idea what the ancient Christian authors wrote. If we had no clue what was originally in the writings of Paul or in the Gospels, this objection might carry more weight. But there is not a textual critic on the planet who thinks this, since not a shred of evidence leads in this direction. And I don't even know a mythicist who is willing to make this claim. As a result, in the vast majority of cases, the wording of these authors is not in dispute." So I think this is a pretty powerful response, again, from a non-Christian to this objection. The only other thing that I'll mention, just real quick and we'll be done, is that some people are concerned about the process of translation. Some people have this foolish idea that the Bible was translated over and over and over again to one language to the next language, kind of like the telephone game. Remember, we've played that before. And then you get to the end and it's a completely different sentence because it was misinterpreted and mistranslated so many times through the process. But people who say this, they don't understand how Bible translation works. It's not as though the Bible the New Testament in particular, was written in Greek, and then we translated it into Latin, and then we translated it from Latin to English, and then from English to whatever new language, a tribe in Africa or Indonesia that we're trying to reach would translate the New Testament from English to their language. That's not how Bible translation works at all, okay? Whenever we make a new translation, even a new English translation, we don't use the Latin or something like that. No, we go back to the Greek. And all the translations we make, even, for a new people group we've discovered in Indonesia, let's say, we make a translation for them, not from our English, but from the original Greek. So we don't have this problem of mistranslating from one language to another. But some people just aren't aware of that. So sometimes you need to gently, respectfully point out some of these things if people are hung up about them.